So I work at, as Monique said, at the V&A Museum. Hands up who's been to the V&A? That's a fair few, that's pretty good. And as Monique said, I'm the Curator of Digital Design, and I look after the collection, which, as well as deciding what comes in, figuring out how to look after it, I'm mostly kind of deciding, why can't I speak today? Deciding what we bring in and what constitutes objects, because the way that we think about a lot of objects now is that they are physical, they have things that you can touch and feel and you can see the edges of, but they become a bit more complex when they become digital. And I wanted to kind of start off this problem by talking about I think it was the first thing that I actually collected, which is this object. Hands up who knows what this object is. Yeah, it's a Minitel. It's adorable. And the Minitel, I've always really loved it because it was a sort of a predecessor of the internet in some ways in France. And it was a little box that sat next to your telephone that you could book tickets with. You could look up, you could send messages to your greengrocer. You could talk to people. And also it's the early days of the Menagerie Rose, which is like a kind of dating and sex chat line. So the really early days of sort of using innovation in slightly different and more subversive ways kind of came from this. And I collected it because it does tell that alternative history of the internet in some ways, but it also is a bit stupid. So when you take it out of the network and off the network, it's just a dumb terminal and you can just write messages on it and that's there. But you don't really get the kind of lifeblood of what it was like to work and be on Minitel at that time. And this is a kind of a contemporary problem that we experience now with digital design. We start thinking quite contemporarily because this is I think other than the Apple II, which I recently acquired, this is one of the oldest things in our collection. Everything else that I'm creating is curating and collecting is very, very contemporary and very much sort of the now. And the way we think about objects in some ways, digital objects in particular, is through these sort of three phrases. And this is something, by the way, this talk is part of my current live research on this. So if a lot of it's a little bit kind of like tangential and a bit wandery, then do forgive me. But this is kind of where my head is thinking at the moment. And you obviously have the design of the object. So you have the physical object and the software side of it. You have the data. So with things like connected objects or anything that's connected to the internet, you have the things that kind of come through it or talk to it or make it work or function in a certain way. And then you have the dialogue around the object, which is not just the people that interact with it, but the political and cultural and socioeconomic circumstances that it exists within. Because we live in a very interesting time, and I really like this heavily academic quote by Amanda Lagvist, which says, talks about living in the digital age as the persistent presence of the infinite in the age of temporal instantaneity, which basically means that things are happening all the time at different rates, like through different services and devices and at different speeds and in different ways, manifestations. It's very hard to keep up, and this is something that is a new challenge for museums and collections in particular, because we not only have to decide what comes in, but act very quickly about what that is, because a lot of it is lost. A lot of it will be lost. So we're currently in a situation where the shortish history, when we have things in our collection which are hundreds and thousands of years old, essentially, and it's one of those things where we always think about what would we, if we could go back and bring back things to complete that story, what could we ask? But actually we have the privilege of access now, not just to historians and the kind of socioeconomic time, but the people who are making it. Like, I'm very lucky that I can go and talk to people and say, why did you make this? How did you make this? And that kind of thing. To kind of talk a bit more about the collection, this is two objects which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, which are the Nest thermostat on the left-hand side and the original first iPhone that we also have in the collection. Now, if you notice, they're not switched on. So when things come into the museum, they never get turned on again. They get filmed, they might get videoed, we might have some documentation around it, but it all depends on the objecthood in that way, and that becomes really complex when we think about the fact that these wouldn't exist and are essentially kind of vessels in some way of the design that is the software and that lays on them. So we are suddenly very quickly having to catch up from historic collecting like this to now, and it's a problem, because when you think about the edges of an object, like if you look at an Eames chair in our collection or a Mondrian chair or any of the things that we have which have a very specific objecthood, and I use the word objecthood quite a lot, and I do apologise, it's a stupid curator collections word. Like, what is the edges and the boundaries of an object? Because essentially, you can't. The iPhone, for instance, connects to many different things, and I can guarantee you, probably maybe not even one person who can tell you the complete system and objecthoodness of an iPhone iOS system. And if you know that person, please tell me, because I want to interview them for my archive. It's not currently possible. And we encounter this problem with our latest collection of Wechat. So Wechat is an amazing, I think it may be the most used social network. It's definitely got billions of users, particularly in Asia. And with Wechat, if you're not familiar with it, you can everything can be centralized through this app. You can book tickets, you can do ride sharing, you can hire a bike, you can do your banking, you can do social media, all of that kind of thing. But unlike Minitel or other things, it's heavily monitored by the Chinese government. So we collected this because it's a really important piece of innovation, and we try not to think too much about comprehensiveness in terms of collecting the whole history of social media or the whole history of certain things. We tend to think about it in terms of points in time or particular conversations that we want to underline and make really explicit. And with Wechat, it obviously is an important part of everyday life for people in Asia. But the way that we collected it was really complex, because obviously we can collect the APK file, and we have a frozen in time APK file that we work with Tencent to create, which will give you an idea of what it was like to interact with that from a very sort of like IX, UX sort of way. You can look at the paper sketches of GIFs, stickers that are put on. We also have the GIFs and stickers that you can play back. We also have Mon, which is one of my favorite objects in the collection, which is an IoT device that parents can use to send like love heart messages to their children when they are away, which is a contemporary problem with parents in China, because a lot of them work out away from home, and keeping that connection is really, really close. And I originally hated this when it came in, but now I absolutely love it. But the biggest problem for us is, and as Brendan, who's one of the curators who worked on it, said, is that you don't get the liveness of what it is to exist on Wechat at that time, because you don't have people on it. We found it very hard to that problem with the data, like the people and what it's like to, if you wanted to, in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, if someone wanted to go back and have a look and be like, okay, so what was it like to work to be on Wechat in 2018 from 2118, if we still have museums, and I hope we do. We want to give them a real reflection and idea of what that looks like, and it's hard because these systems are like difficult to access, and there's interesting things around privacy and personal data laws where we actually work with someone to try and get them to donate their profile, but the problem with that is that you have other people interested in their profile, and if it's someone just broadcasting themselves, then it's just like early Twitter, which no one wants. But yeah, so these are the kind of problems I'm thinking through, because there are other acquisitions that we would like to make that we're thinking in much in the same ways, and these are two of the most important pieces of digital design probably in the Western world at some point, which is the Bloomberg Terminal on the left-hand side, which is a terrifying object, and I love it because it's just a complete, can I swear? Clusterfuck of information. Because you basically, the biggest financial world economies are driven on this platform in many ways, because these are kind of used by traders essentially to make decisions about kind of what to sell and to trade and to make kind of massive judgments on. But if you look at it, the design of it is mental. Like it's very intuitive, and it relies on previous assumptions and biases around what we understand certain colors to mean and certain peaks of troughs of information to mean, and then you have to combine it all together into a thing. But obviously, this is a proprietary service, and which is the biggest problem that we're having with museums, which is really interesting, is that a lot of these digital design objects today exist on services that, one, we can't have access to the code to if we wanted to preserve it, but also we can't have transparent conversations about. And obviously, that's not a new problem. We will never be able to talk to Eames and various people about why, like the really difficult politics of that. But this is a slightly different shift in that way. And it also costs like £25,000 a year to even have access to that, to the point where in the future show we couldn't have a live data set because they were worried about people trading from it, it's very interesting. Which I completely understand, because it's their business model, and that's what they want to make sure that they also want to show that it's important in that way. And on the right-hand side, you have Instagram. Another thing, which is like, originally I wanted to collect the original 6 or 8 filters made by Cole Rise. For the collection, but the algorithms are just algorithms. They depend on this platform and the dependencies of this platform. So we were like, well, what would it be like to collect Instagram? Again, we don't have access to the code, and we don't have the ability to reinvigorate and to resurrect that, which is the biggest problem with if you want to learn anything from it. And it's all of these weird problems that we're working through. And again, this is all very much live research that I'm doing at the moment, so I don't have any particular answers for this at the moment. But the second thing I wanted to talk about, apart from the data and the problem with data and the problem with things like proprietary software and the inaccessibility of being able to actually look deeply at this stuff, is the dialogues that we put people in touch with when we come to a museum. So whenever we collect things in the museum, we collect it with the idea of it being displayed. We never acquire something unless it can be shown and shared and accessed and studied by people in the future, because ultimately we're living in a very contemporary time, and there will be people who want to know how we got here just as much as we go back to museums to understand how we got here now. And I have a slightly different, I think my department in particular have a very particular conversation around what we understand that history to be. And I think history is happening on a daily basis, obviously, in many ways, but we want people who are creating technology and design now in conversation with things that are happening now, not kind of waiting a bit and being like, oh, well, we'll see how that pans out, that kind of thing. Or maybe we'll look 10 years ago and look at that kind of stuff. But this is an initiative that we started in 2013 called Rapid Response Collecting, which I'm one of the curators for. And it's an initiative to collect objects that tell of a very political now. So it could be from manufacturing or industry or technology to particular objects which tell us something about the kind of contemporary time we live in. But they all kind of come in, literally, we collect them and then they arrive and then we put them on. It's like, I think the quickest time we've put something on display from seeing it in the news to being on display was 3 days. But usually at museums, you wait like 10, 15, 25, 50 years for these things to even come into museums and to gain significance. So on the left, you have the pussy hat, which was made famous during the Women's Day March last year. Is it last year? Yeah. Last year, which we account for as a digital object, because this is, in a knitting museum or in a textiles museum, it would be seen as a political act of knitting, but we see it as a digital object because it would not have had the reach or the breadth or the conversation it had if it hadn't been shared on social networks, if the pattern had been. So we're trying to redefine and rethink about what digital objects are in that way. It's not just software and hardware, it's also the things that manifest and become digital, because in some kind of lengths, all things we touch and deal with now are digital. They are digitally mediated. They are put through not just kind of like the software side of things, but like they're photographed and they're reappropriated and they get understood in different ways. And I think we're quite keen to address that. And this is a gallery you can see in the V&A that's been there for a few years now. And we've collected things like the Amazon Wearable Terminal, which is a horrific object, which is worn by Amazon warehouse workers to essentially track and trace and to help guide them around the warehouse so that they can collect things. And the reason why we collected this is because this is a pure cyborg level stuff, because the people who work in this aren't treated like people with kind of, in the same way that when you go into a library, you kind of, a supermarket, you'd be like, the bathroom cleaner is next to the bathroom sponges. That's not how the Amazon warehouse works. It will look at algorithms and define and place things next to things that are more likely to be bought together. And you get a map on your arm and you follow it around. But obviously there's a big controversy in 2014, 2015, when they realized that people's bathroom breaks and the time they stopped and rested were being tracked as well and being used against them. And suddenly all these weird labor laws around, like, we thought cyborgism was supposed to be like making us better, but actually it's reducing the livelihood and welfare of people who work today. To the Mosquito Emoji, which has just made it into the latest iOS, but it was actually put forward by the Johns Hopkins Hospital and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a way for them to easily track disease tracking of mosquito-based illnesses and diseases in across the world, not just in the kind of global south. But these are all objects which are very political and of a time. But we even have problems with those things. This is for some reason I put this in here because I love it. It's the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which I recently put in the museum, which is a controller which it has been designed with a very specific specification to be allow those with less abilities essentially to plug in and customize and make their own gaming experiences, which are previously quite unaffordable and quite clunky and actually just not very attractive. And they work really hard to make sure that this looked like a thing that anyone would have on their home, rather than being like, this is the special version of this. And I interviewed the designer on our blog, which you should read because he's really nice and really interesting. But we have problems at the moment about how we put objects and put what the future implications of objects may be in the museum. Because as I mentioned earlier, we're really keen for us not to be seen as a way of just looking back. We want to have a look at the ever-changing, quickly, rapidly morphing present. And particularly for designers to use us as a resource, and for designers to come in and have conversations with the assumptions and biases they have around the things they're currently making. And also finding new ways of trying to represent and explore those. This is DNA phenotyping, which is interesting as a technology. Essentially, it's something where you can swab the inside of your mouth or some spit or some chewing gum, and it enables them to generate a portrait of you, or what they think you look like, based on a few sort of factors that witnesses may give, like, oh, they were white, we think they were male, that kind of thing. But essentially, I wanted to find a way of representing this piece of software in the collection. And the problem is we're putting things in the collection, and we write justifications and we can put some curatorial input, but there's a level of context that is lost when I leave or when I go. And we wanted to have a think about how you could represent this quite difficult and political piece of software. And so we collected Radical Love by Heather Dewey-Hagborg, which leans towards my own interest in speculative futures and speculative design, and it's a portrait of two portraits of Chelsea Manning that were generated using the same software and same technique when she was in prison, allowing her to kind of create a portrait for herself. But also, what it does in turn is represent the gender biases that are present in this DNA phenotyping. So on the left is the neutral. When you select neutral on the generation kind of profile, that's what it has. And on the right-hand side is the feminine one. And it makes very subtly and very carefully aware of what they assume men and women and gender to be embodied as well as kind of providing a new weird way of portraiture. And the other thing that I've been really interested in lately is predictive policing software, which for some goddamn reason keeps perpetuating as being a solution to the police. So any law enforcers in the room, don't use it, please. But it's a piece of software which is based on historic data sets from kind of the archives of that particular place, that particular town, which is then fed into an algorithm to determine where the new or the potential crime hotspots may be. But the problem is that we cease or have not acknowledged the fact that historically the collection of those data sets are unbelievably racist. Like stop and searching, the way that black and Hispanic men have been particularly targeted more than white men are all fed into these systems, and then they get turned into this idea of like an objective or neutral law enforcement mechanism. And it means that the people who have already been targeted for decades are being targeted again, and there's no analysis of that because it's just been seen as truth and information. And we've always been I've been intrigued about how we would go about collecting this, because one, we don't have access to the mechanisms. We don't have access to that because of course, if we as a museum could have it, and the idea of us giving access to people to study it would maybe put that in tension with what the police are trying to do with this, which is maybe not telling you everything that they want you to know, which are other anxieties that we have. And again, this whole talk is basically things and problems that we as a museum are trying to think through, because it's really important that we think about them now. Because if we want designers who are currently kind of in the future or upcoming to be able to fluently interrogate these political and cultural issues, then we want them to have some form of comparison or some ways to interrogate it. And I always love this project by the New Inquiry, which kind of flips that on its head, which is called the white collar crime risk zone, which does the same thing, where it will kind of quite jokingly feed this stuff in and say, okay, so if you're using this on us, we're going to flip this back on your head. And they go back and look at the ways at which white collar crime particularly generated this white male portrait. People who've done like massive scandals against, like in banks and against people and that kind of thing. So I kind of left with a bunch of questions, but there's also some ways that I want to think through how museums can serve and what they can be seen as. Because I know that I think my talk was called Things of the Future, and actually I am thinking about the future with this, because we have a responsibility in some ways to think through this. And here's some positional statements that I'm going to make, because this is what you're supposed to do at end of talks. The digital object in the museum should reflect the way we live with the digital today, which is this amorphous, edgeless, dynamic, and very embedded thing. And that complexity is in both parts really exciting, but it's also, again, completely going to blow my brain for the next, 15, 20 years if I still have a job. They haven't automated me yet, which is apparently very, very unlikely. Thanks, Nesta. But the idea of like how we make sure the collection works for people in that way, and actually allows in the future all of the work that a lot of people are doing in the room is thought through, or is and how you make it, because obviously at the V&A we have a really massive interest in process and craft, and how we show the work, how we got there, and what the machinations and different tools and things, and even things like I've been considering collecting data sets, the historic data sets which are noted to increase or to be kind of introduce bias into systems. So you have things like the IMDb actors database, which was used to train age, which, because Julia Roberts, who is nearly 50, doesn't look 50, ages women very differently, which when you start to see that bias is quite interesting. And also the fact that the Chicago Police Internment Database was used to identify kind of race, and again makes very racist assumptions. So how you bring in those bits and pieces and that record, so that when you look at a kind of a collection and see what it was trying to tell you about design in 2018, you get a kind of an idea of it. And then this idea of completeness. And completeness is a massive anxiety. So the future, like the past, as we all know, we still have questions, will be incomplete. And what we prioritise and what we actually have to let go and leave behind is what really matters. And the reason why I wanted to include that bit about the prioritisation of things that have to carry forward and what we leave behind, because we're not going to be able to keep everything, not just because of space, but because there's a point where when you have so much, it's like it kind of ceases to become relevant. And that's an exercise as us as curators, and actually opening up that process to practitioners and working more with people and talking to them about what sort of things we really should be pulling in and we should be putting next to the objects or as part of an object, or to make the complete object, because we do have, as I mentioned earlier, the privilege of access in that point. And then the last bit is the museum collection is a means to look forward and not just to look back. And obviously people go to museums to see how we got there, and they go back and look at kind of wonderful old pieces of craft from people who have done things that we want to kind of look at the awe of in some ways. But actually, like, it should be a point for projection and a point of speculation, and you should go to a museum collection and like ask, well, if that's there, where are we going to go next? Like, why is that there? Why is this being underlined as significant? Why is this being there? And I would love it if a museum was not a place where you went it was a place that you went to really question your own assumptions and your own understanding about what design could be, and is a much more active participant in that design process. And I know it's a really weird thing to say, museums should be an active participant in design processes, but I really hope so. It'd be really great, because like, you learn a lot from history, and you learn a lot from the ways that we can kind of pull things out in isolation, and take a really, really good and really deep look at them, because I am fully aware of the fact that we're living in very quick and very fast and very difficult times. And I know that museums might not seem like the priority at the moment, but I want to kind of create some space for conversation, and if I can do it through putting some stuff in a big, fancy Victorian era room, then so be it. But yeah, thank you very much. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't have a lot of questions. I can imagine how difficult it must be. I was sitting last year when we took the whole ThingsCon group to Shenzhen. I was sitting in a nightclub next to the owner on Wechat, and we could live translate and chat to each other. I mean, how do you capture that in a museum? It's all storytelling, right?
Yeah, no, totally. It's something where the kind of the role of social histories is really interesting as well. Like the idea of like capturing that stuff and talking to people, and it's how you try and bring that in, so that if you lose some part of it, you still have some fidelity. And I mean, we're never going to get high levels of fidelity with life, because I mean, reality itself is not particularly. So make up a word, fidel? No, that's the wrong one.
But reality is very
it's not particularly
exciting,
sharp and easy to term at the moment. So
thank you so much.
Thank you.